In 2015, a cave explorer in South Africa found a narrow underground passage, so tight you had to exhale to fit through it. At the end, in a chamber that no light had ever reached, were bones. Hundreds of them, carefully arranged. No predators had dragged them there, the passage was too small. No flood had washed them in, the arrangement was deliberate. Someone had carried those bodies through total darkness, through a gap barely wide enough to breathe, and laid them down with intention. The species that did it had a brain 1/3 smaller than yours, and it had been doing this for 300,000 years. We have always assumed that how we treat our dead separates us from everything else. That burial, mourning, ritual, these are the things that make us human. The evidence says something more uncomfortable than that. It says we were not the first, and it says the gap between us and whatever came before is much smaller than we have ever been willing to admit. Go back 60,000 years. A man dies in a cave in what is now northern Iraq. He is laid on his side, knees drawn toward his chest, the way a child curls in sleep. Around his body, someone has placed branches. 8 different species of flowers, chosen deliberately, carried from miles away. We know this not from any record. We know it because the pollen preserved in the soil around his bones for 6 decades of millennia. When archaeologists found him in 1960 at a site called Shanidar Cave, they named him Shanidar I. He had lived to middle age old for that era, with a withered arm, a crushed eye socket, and healed fractures across his entire body. He had been injured severely enough that he could not have survived without help. Someone had kept him alive for years, and when he finally died, someone had buried him with flowers. That detail stopped researchers cold. Not because it was sentimental, because it was unnecessary. Flowers do nothing for the dead. They serve no survival function. Placing them required time, effort, and planning. Whoever buried Shanidar I understood that he was gone and did something for him anyway. That is not instinct. That is something else entirely. But Shanidar was not the beginning. Not even close. In 2015, deep inside the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa, researcher Rick Hunter squeezed through a passage 18 centimeters wide at its narrowest point, roughly the width of your hand. What he found on the other side would take 2 years for the scientific community to fully accept. A chamber filled with the deliberately deposited remains of at least 15 individuals of a species called Homo Naledi, a species with a brain roughly the size of an orange, 1/3 the volume of yours. The paleoanthropologists who analyzed the site ruled out every alternative explanation one by one. Predators could not have dragged them there, the passage was too narrow. Water could not have carried them, there was no evidence of flooding. Accidental accumulation was statistically impossible given the distribution. The only remaining explanation was the one that made the researchers most uncomfortable. Homo Naledi, a creature we had classified as too primitive for complex thought, had been carrying its dead into that chamber intentionally, repeatedly, over an extended period of time. Berger, who led the excavation, said publicly that this finding forced a fundamental rethinking of what the capacity for symbolic behavior actually requires. We had assumed it required a large brain. The evidence no longer supported that assumption. Here is what almost no one covers when they talk about ancient burial. It was never just about the body. At a site called Sungur, 180 miles northeast of Moscow, archaeologists uncovered graves dating back 34,000 years. Inside, they found 2 children buried head to head, a boy of around 12, a girl of around 10. Both had been covered in more than 10,000 mammoth ivory beads, each bead individually carved, each requiring roughly 45 minutes of work to produce. Per bead. The math is not subtle. Someone spent the equivalent of an entire year doing nothing but carving beads for children who were already dead. The graves also contained fox teeth pendants, carved animal figurines, and 2 mammoth ivory spears laid alongside the bodies, straightened by a technique we still do not fully understand. These were not practical objects. They were statements. Someone was saying something about who these children were, about what they deserved, about what existed after the moment of death, even if that something was only memory. Researchers who study mortuary behavior describe this pattern as evidence of what they call afterlife cognition, not necessarily belief in heaven. Something more fundamental. The ability to imagine a person continuing to exist in some form after their body stops working, to feel that the dead are still owed something, that the relationship does not end when the breathing does. That cognitive capacity, the ability to feel obligations to someone who no longer exists, is the same capacity that produces art, religion, law, and every social contract human civilization has ever built. It does not appear suddenly in the archaeological record. It appears gradually, in burial sites, tens of thousands of years before writing, before cities, before anything we normally point to as the beginning of civilization. The grief came first. Everything else was built on top of it. In the Kafsa cave in Palestine, researchers found burial sites dating back 92,000 years. A woman buried with a child that was not her own. Red ochre, a pigment that had to be mined, processed, and transported, dusted across the bodies. At Sungur, the ivory beads show evidence of being worn before burial, transferred from the living to the dead. At sites across Europe and the Middle East, bodies are found with their heads oriented in specific specific directions, knees positioned identically, hands placed in arrangements too consistent to be accidental. These are not isolated behaviors. They are a pattern running across species, across continents, across hundreds of thousands of years. Something in the architecture of minds that were becoming human kept arriving at the same conclusion: that a dead person was still a person, that they deserved something, that the world was different now that they were gone. Paleoanthropologist Francesco D'Erico, who has spent his career mapping the emergence of symbolic behavior, describes it this way: the treatment of the dead is the clearest window we have into when a mind became capable of abstraction, of imagining things that are not physically present. You cannot mourn someone without holding a model of them inside your mind after they are gone. That mental model of a person who no longer exists but still matters is the same cognitive operation that produces every other form of human symbolic thought. Grief, in this reading, is not a byproduct of consciousness. It may be one of the engines that built it. In 1908, two amateur archaeologists in France uncovered what became known as the Old Man of La Chapelle-aux-Saints, a Neanderthal, buried in a deliberately dug pit, body positioned carefully, large animal bones placed nearby. The find was controversial for over a century. Researchers argued about whether the pit was intentional or natural, whether the positioning was deliberate or coincidental, whether Neanderthals were capable of that kind of behavior at all. In 2013, a team re-excavated the site with modern tools and settled the argument. The pit had been dug. The body had been placed. The bones around him had been selected. The old man had been buried by people who looked almost exactly like you do, who had brains almost exactly the same size as yours, who had never been considered fully human by science until that moment. He died approximately 60,000 years ago. Think about that number. He had severe arthritis throughout his spine, his hips, and his jaw. His teeth were almost entirely gone. He could not have hunted. He could not have kept up with a moving group. Someone had been feeding him, caring for him, keeping him alive for what researchers estimate was years before his death. And when he died, they buried him. Here is what the data keeps arriving at, across every site, every species, every era. The capacity to grieve is not a late addition to the human story. It is not a refinement that came after language or agriculture or civilization. It appears at the very beginning of the archaeological record, in the earliest minds that were becoming something more than animal. And it does not appear alone. Wherever researchers find evidence of deliberate burial, they find evidence of something else alongside it. Planning, symbolism, care extended beyond the moment of death. The understanding that a life had value that did not disappear when the body did. We did not develop consciousness and then learn to grieve. The evidence suggests it may have happened the other way around. That grief, the specific cognitive experience of holding someone in your mind after they are gone, was one of the pressures that built the kind of mind capable of everything that followed. The cave at Rising Star is still being excavated. There are more chambers, more remains. The species that carried its dead through an 18-centimeter passage in complete darkness, tens of thousands of years before the first human civilization, has not finished telling us what it knew. We found their bones. We found how carefully they had been placed. What we cannot find, and what the data cannot reach, is what it felt like to be the one doing the carrying. To bring someone you had known through total darkness, through a gap barely wide enough to breathe, and lay them down in a place where no light had ever reached. Whether that felt like what you feel when you lose someone, the data does not say. But someone made the journey, and that means something was there to make it.